Welcome to Decarbonizing Commerce, where we explore what's new, interesting, and actionable at the intersection of climate innovation and commerce. I'm your host, Keith Anderson, and together we'll meet entrepreneurs and innovators reinventing retail, e-commerce, and consumer products through the lenses of low carbon and commercial viability. Welcome to the Decarbonizing Commerce podcast. I'm Keith Anderson, and my guest this week is Ankit Patel, who is Vice President, Sustainable Solutions at ZeroMe and VP Emerging Business at its parent company, Breakthrough. ZeroMe is a platform that lets companies engage their workforce to align their employees with the company's sustainability goals. And I've known Ankit for, I think, at least a decade. During our conversation, he helpfully reminded me that we met when I was leading a consultancy focused on e-commerce and online grocery, and he was driving e-commerce sales at Georgia Pacific. But I followed his career as he's rounded the bases at some really interesting players in the e-commerce and CPG landscape. And as he transitioned to a business development and executive role at a company that is focused on sustainability. And we got to cover a lot of interesting topics like the commonalities and distinctions between the rise of e-commerce and online grocery and now the rise of sustainability, and what some of the inflection or tipping points might be that are going to nudge this discipline and this topic to the same level of sort of mainstream interest and adoption that we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years with e-commerce. Ankit is a really sharp guy, and he's doing some interesting and I think pioneering work at ZeroMe. So I'm excited for you to meet him and learn from him. Here's Ankit Patel of ZeroMe. Ankit, thanks for joining the Decarbonizing Commerce podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it, Keith. Thanks for having me.
Well, you and I have known each other for, I don't know, probably a decade, maybe longer. If I recall, we met when you were at Boxed, one of the pioneering retailers of the sort of mobile first era. And, you've had a really fascinating career largely in retail and e-commerce. But, our paths crossed again when you joined your latest venture. So maybe an interesting place to start is just helping the audience that doesn't know you like I do hear a bit about your career and pathway to what you're doing now.
Yeah, for sure. I've had a pretty cool journey. Been able to do a lot of different things in a lot of different industries and a lot of different specialties. So, out of college, I started in manufacturing, worked up in distribution, mainly with kind of big CPG companies, more well-known companies. Made the jump to bigger CPG back in 2012 with Georgia Pacific, and had an opportunity at that time to kind of pivot into the e-commerce world, which at that time I viewed very similar to where we are relative to sustainability, is that there was a lot of buzz about it and a lot of people trying to figure out how to go about it. I led a lot of PeerClick, got to understand Amazon a little bit better, called on that account. And then, as you mentioned, we met around that time, but then I pivoted over to Boxed, which was one of the emerging retailers. And, from there, I spent about 7 years in the startup world, which was really cool. Piqued my curiosity, a different kind of energy, and just a lot of really cool stuff, and working with a lot of cool creative people. Again, mainly in the CPG e-commerce space, a little bit of B2B stuff in there. And then I had this opportunity pop up, and opportunity to connect with an old colleague of mine who I, enjoyed working with. And the sustainability thing really caught my interest. Is, the point I drew was, again, back to the e-commerce days of like, there's this new frontier coming, and we just need a lot of people to figure it out. And it's very important, not only for the climate, not only for the world, but it's going to be, you could see a lot of countries and government and everyone, being involved in this space, and a lot more interest from a company perspective. So if I think about it from just a personal standpoint, the opportunity was there. The curiosity was there. So I think it was a pretty cool intersection, and that's why I'm here today.
So where you are is a company called Breakthrough, and you're sort of in a subsidiary called ZeroMe. Tell us about what the parent company does, and then tell us more about the initiative that you're really driving.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Breakthrough, we specialize basically in transportation, and we work with shipper clients to optimize their energy spend. So we have a tremendous amount of transportation scope 3 type of information. One level above that is, we're owned, our parent company's US Venture. They're based up in Wisconsin. And they have a very, very strong interest in sustainability, which is where kind of ZeroMe came about. And, I would say our product's about 3 years old. We're hitting market now. We've spent a lot of time developing it, but really this came out of our passion to just create a more sustainable future. One of our core values is finding a better way. And I think this fits that extremely well, as how do we find a better way to operate our business? So ultimately, a couple of people within the organization had an idea of ZeroMe, and I think what we struggled with, or what just generally companies struggle with, is like, how do we drive awareness, and how do we drive education, and how do we drive engagement to sustainability? And I think the way I always think about it is, there's probably generally most companies have 2, 3, 4 people in a room making decisions about sustainability, but truly, like, to make meaningful change longer term, it really takes a village. So just kind of taking that concept of like, how do we get sustainability and how do we get action into more people's hands is really essentially the problem that we're trying to solve. And here we go. And that's how ZeroMe was born. So I think, if when we say carbon footprint, I think people generally know what that terminology is, but really what ZeroMe enables is like, what is your carbon footprint? What is my carbon footprint? And it really enables an individual to understand what their carbon footprint is, which begins the life cycle of how they can continue to improve it. And there's a bunch of other features in the app that we get into, but ultimately that's really how it was founded, or how ZeroMe kind of came about, is that it started with our core value from our parent company of really finding a better way. And this is a great example of us really trying to find a better way, and not only just operating business, but trying to increase and we have a strong mission around driving a more sustainable future. So we thought this was a great way to do it.
Yeah, I think it resonates with a lot of what I see and hear with companies of all scales and maturity levels, but especially the largest, big brands and retailers that are making commitments. They're trying to embed sustainability principles and skills across the enterprise. I think what I see a lot of are the kinds of consulting and training initiatives that remind me of, to your point earlier, the early days of the rise of e-commerce and online grocery, really focusing on jobs to be done within the business. But I think what you are doing with ZeroMe is an interesting complement, because you're sort of starting with your personal footprint and some of the decisions you make in your everyday individual life about how do I get around and what do I eat. And so maybe you can go into a little more detail about what somebody that participates with ZeroMe sort of sees and does with it.
Yeah, so let me share a little bit just in terms of the life cycle of the app. So basically, when we onboard a user would go answer about 8 to 10 questions. And from there, we are able to build a pretty sophisticated carbon footprint for that individual. And then from there, they have visibility, and we break it down. We primarily focus on, because it's a employee engagement tool from for a workplace or a company, we really focus on like scope 3 work from home, or scope 3 just work related emissions. But within that, we also talk about transportation, personal footprint, shopping. So people really have an idea of what is making up their carbon footprint. So from there, you can't stop there. It's not the only, that's great information, but it doesn't tell people what they could do to improve. So we have a section called the Discover section, which is really the latest and greatest news. So that's our ability to go share relevant content, whether it's from a company perspective, a world, a policy perspective, or whatever it may be. So that is our ability. One of the things is how do we drive awareness and education? And so we view the Discover section of the platform as the piece that really drives the awareness and the education behind it. The other section we have is kind of habits. So we feature hundreds of habits that people can change as part of their lifestyle. So everything from using a water bottle to eating no beef, to eating less beef, to composting your food. So these are just examples. Now, we're also very realistic that it's important to surface a lot of habits because, don't expect people to drop beef overnight because I know people like that. So it is a balance, but also part of the habits becomes the education piece of it. And why does, probably the average consumer probably doesn't know why beef has such an impact or cows have such an impact on our environment. So again, we view that as the educational part of it. And then lastly, by going back to the Discover section, people read Discover section, there's quizzes and you can rate things. So there's this big engagement section of the app. When you add habits, you get points. When you take quizzes and you answer questions right, you get points. And all of that essentially leads into what we think about the engagement section of the app, which are leaderboards and contests and badges, right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, we do want to provide a little bit of an incentive for people to kind of use and learn about the app. But we also want to make it fun because we essentially, let's not all go back to high school and school and just kind of drill a bunch of content and books. But how do we truly make this a competitive thing? How do we truly make this, as we mentioned, it kind of takes a village, but how do we create a little competition? How do we create this team atmosphere? And really the way when we're talking to companies, we're really thinking about this is a way to embed sustainability into your culture, right? And that's kind of the way we're thinking about it. So we truly want this to be, visible across the teams. We want competition. We want people to really be thinking about this and kind of making it fun. So that's a little bit about the app and the experience.
Well, you anticipated and answered one of my questions about engagement because I was curious, how are you encouraging people to keep coming back? It sounds like, as people are using the app, are they providing information about the decisions or the behavioral changes that they're making? So you've got a list of habits. Are they then recording some of those behavioral shifts?
Yeah. So what we do is essentially when they add, the really cool thing about this is, and especially if I'm thinking about it from a company lens, if I'm a sustainability leader or an HR leader, we have a dashboard dedicated to kind of a client administrator where they have insights and they gather all the data. Now, very important to call out that all this is anonymized and aggregated, so there's nothing specific to an individual. But ultimately, so what we do is we aggregate it in the form of charts and queries and reports. And that really enables a sustainability lead to understand what their workforce cares about and wants to do. And then that could essentially prompt additional action. So, I think that's a really cool part of this is we really catered this product for organizations and for leaderships and C-suites and sustainability leaders to really understand how their workforce thinks about sustainability and feels about sustainability, which should then inform, future steps or everything else. So, so there's, it's a pretty cool little tool that just goes outside of just this carbon footprint calculator, but really it's this all-encompassing solution that, we, at the end of the day, we're really trying to drive change. And that's what we believe that this data enables.
What are you finding is most effective in terms of driving that initial trial and adoption of the app? I think in some companies you've got passionate, sometimes vocal, but usually minorities within the company that are trying to move the needle entrepreneurially. I imagine when you deploy something like this, you're hopeful that essentially every employee gets onboarded. But I would imagine there are some hurdles or headwinds to that. How are you driving trial and adoption?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, listen, I think it's frankly, it's a struggle that most companies face in terms of, again, how do we make sustainability more top of mind? Not, the number one priority or anything, but like, how do we just drive more visibility to it? And, I will be, in my very kind of humble opinion, like, we don't necessarily have everything figured out. This being essentially kind of a startup, it requires to learn and pivot, which we have been doing. So the addition of the additional engagement features is one where, again, like initially this didn't really, it really wasn't part of the kind of initial version of the app, but really this is where we really needed to lean in and think about it. And then, there's a couple like market level insights that really led us. So I think generally people want to make a difference, but they're not going to actively go find ways to make a difference. So like by us surfacing habits and content, we hope that we can essentially push content down to users versus it being them having to individually pull it. But really, I think it just comes down to, again, the challenge that organizations face in really just driving awareness around sustainability. And I think this is what I would call the easy way to go do that. Like essentially, we can put a platform in the hands of their workforce that will essentially do that for them. So that's essentially, ultimately the problem that we're trying to solve. But, I would say due to the age of our app, I would say from a retention perspective, we're probably well early on. So I think we're talking more about acquisition. And I think the companies who are interested in this product are the ones that truly do struggle with driving education and awareness around the app. So, So, I think, the retention piece is to be seen. I think we'll continue to evolve and think about the engagement experience and truly the customer experience. The other, interesting thing is we're thinking about how do you build proper rewards, right? But not rewards where you're giving people gift cards and cash, but like more around how you can people can continue to have a positive impact, or just a sustainable impact in their lifestyle, whether it's through products that are more sustainably known or working with carbon reduction projects. So I think these are things that we're constantly challenged with. And again, going back to just my career and my experience, these are the fun things that really just kind of fuel us to continue to evolve the experience, knowing that we're still in our infancy. But this is definitely a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah. And are you finding there are roles or functions that are, most likely to introduce this to their organization? Is it happening in the C-suite? Is it sustainability or HR? Who really is driving this?
Yeah, I would tell you the most energizing conversations come from the sustainability leaders, of course, because this is right up their alley and this is something that they struggle with. So they love aspects of the app that really go drive the awareness and the impressions within their organization about sustainability. So that's one angle. The other interesting angle that we've been talking to is just from an HR perspective. And if we think about it from a total rewards perspective, there's a lot of studies out there that show a direct impact of companies who are forward thinking about sustainability have direct impact on retention and recruiting. So if we think of the cost to replace an employee, and even if you could save one employee because of these initiatives, there's a significant ROI if you think about it solely from that lens. So when we kind of make that connection back to recruiting and retention with HR leaders, kind of piques their interest a little bit. So, it's like kind of understanding your audience a little bit better, but really knowing that there's a lot of trends and there's a tremendous amount of articles about how sustainability really impacts the overall company culture, and how especially a younger workforce is thinking about the companies and the choices and the decision factors that go in through their head and choosing a company to work with. Sustainability is at the top. So it's one, if not, one of the few at the top. So I would say those two paths right now, sustainability leaders for sure, and then HR is another route.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which was the similarity between where sustainability is now and where e-commerce was back when you and I met. And I'm glad you reminded me that we actually met when you were at Georgia Pacific. I forgot. It's so funny how commonly, people that I've known for a long time, I'm like, I look over their LinkedIn and I'm like, where did I meet you? That's how I know I've been around for a while. But, I share your view that there's a lot of similarities. What have you found to be some of the differences? There's certainly things that I think are similar, especially it's a new thing. We know it's going to impact the business. We've got to figure out how to evolve and adapt. But there's a couple of things I would point to for sure as distinctions. What are you finding?
Yeah, I would say, okay, if I think about it in parallels, like both of them require some sort of investment, which is one interesting. I think e-commerce became this really shiny, bright object where, Amazon at the forefront. And I think there's this big kind of this FOMO thing of like, we need to be a part of this because like, I think the visibility of the transformation, I think was a little greater in the e-commerce front. Could be biased a little bit from me just kind of being, that consumed 100% of my work life at that time. But I just felt even as a consumer, I just think like we saw it a whole lot more. And I don't think, quite frankly, I just don't think it was as polarizing as sustainability sometimes has this image. And it's, it's unfortunate. I think, I don't want to get into that aspect of it, but ultimately, e-commerce kind of really had a direct impact on all consumers, and whether it was work related or personal related, it was just more in the limelight. And I think sustainability is not necessarily that way, where it's not hitting us right in front of the face. So I think those are some of the challenges. So I think sustainability is a little bit more in the background, and I think e-commerce is a little bit more in the foreground.
Yeah. I think that's right. Although it's funny because I would agree that e-com wasn't polarized in the way that sustainability in some contexts is. But I remember there were a lot of the same fears and concerns about whether it was going to be profitable or is it going to be dilutive, and what's the impact on brand equity, and you mentioned earlier they both require investment. I think part of the tension in some situations and some sort of strategic and tactical aspects of sustainability is whether it's an investment with an expected return, or is it really just going to be a higher cost? And I think, that seems to be threading that needle seems to be where the greatest appetite in corporate culture is at the moment. If you can persuade me that this is going to grow sales or lower cost without requiring dramatic capital investment or other changes to how I work, I'm more likely to listen. But similarly, I'm always looking for the commonalities and distinctions this area has versus things like e-commerce, AI, retail media. The sort of high velocity trends that are capturing a lot of the attention and budgets. To look for ways that this might cross a similar sort of tipping point, and all of a sudden it is in your face. What do you think is likeliest to drive it to that point? Do you think?
I think it's a couple things. I think one, going back to the conversation around HR and really tying it back to ROI, and I think this is kind of where, if you think about my background and like sustainability and truly commercializing a business and trying to think about it from that lens, I understand there's a major financial component and that people care about that, right? So I think we have to justify that. That's the kindness part of it, and finding companies who actually don't have to worry about money, and finding a million Patagonias, right? That's going to be really, really challenging. So we really have to tie it back to business performance. The second piece of it is I think from a policy, if you think about it from a global perspective, a policy and legislation perspective, You're starting to see a lot of programs that, in action now are going to lead to financial implications down the road. So whether they're cap and trade programs in the EU, Canadian taxes on diesel fuel or, forecasted to go up over 100% in the next, 5-7 years, things like that are going to start having a direct impact. So if companies aren't reducing their emissions, they're going to have to pay for it one way or another. So, there's a couple different angles on it right now, but I would say, the policy and legislation side are certainly accelerating some of this, and it's getting companies to start thinking about it. You hear a lot of 2030. 2030 is not too far from us right now. So I think that's essentially the kind of tactic that's going to force the company's hand a little bit, and it's going to make them think about reducing their emissions, and if they don't have plans. But I think we have the luxury of having a lot of awesome clients, and we have some pretty. We just did one of our flagship annual conference a couple weeks ago. And there's essentially a whole day that's almost dedicated to sustainability for that part. And there's just so much just participation and just enthusiasm around it that it's encouraging that people are actually thinking about it and trying to figure it out. So, which also leads to the point where it's kind of like the only way we're going to make this happen is that if everyone is part of the solution versus, I don't know if Tesla can go manufacture 5 million trucks tomorrow, but if they don't have buyers, then, it's just not going to work. So it truly takes the collective, which is kind of the encouraging part of it. And even from my, year and a half at the company, when I started last year, there's a noticeable difference today versus where we were early last year. So.
Yeah. I also see there's so much sort of pending regulatory and legislative activity, certainly in Europe, but in a few of the major U.S. states also, and Canada, as you noted. There's no question that's going to be a driving force. I was literally just listening to a webinar where they're talking about, in addition to some of the policies you mentioned, EPR, and there's just a laundry list of acronyms that you've got to learn if you want to be fluent in this space. Yeah. I think the mention of Tesla is pretty important too, because one of the things that drew me into this space is how much investment and innovation is happening, in the industry that you and I spend a ton of time in, retail and consumer products, really trying to do what I think many credit Tesla with doing, which is building a product with a lower footprint, but doing it in a way that made it interesting to make that choice purely on the merits of, I like how quickly it accelerates. I like how it looks. Almost every company of any scale that I hear focusing on this area, take Walmart, take Procter, they're all talking about trying to make the everyday choice or making the right choice, the easy choice every day. And they're trying to do that by making it, at cost parity or more affordable without compromising quality or you name it. And so I'm looking for more of those success stories. And I think that the other leg of the stool that is starting to really open eyes, and, I talk about Walmart all the time on this front, but, some of the near-term disruptive impacts to supply chain and operations from the sort of already present impacts of higher temperatures and extreme weather. That doesn't necessarily lead you to immediately reduce your emissions, but it starts to help reinforce the relationship between, our historical emissions are already leading to these kinds of disruptions in business continuity today. So we've got to get more resilient and agile to get the same results that we're accustomed to. And if we don't move sooner than later on the emissions reduction front, it's only going to be a steeper hill to climb over time.
No, you're right. And again, I think that just to your point, I think it really, and I don't know if you feel it, but like, again, like I think where we were a year, 24 months, 36 months ago, I just feel there's a little bit more traction, especially within, the clients and the industries that we work with. And I just think, going to UPS and like last mile delivery, and you could see UPS and FedEx, like, having basically zero emissions vehicles, and like Amazon doing the same thing. It was pretty cool. I was on the West Coast this last weekend, and I saw the Tesla truck, which I think Frito-Lay actually has, and they have a partner program going on. But for the first time, I saw it on the road, and kind of made me think about like, wow, like for one, it looked cool. I think too, like I've heard the drivers enjoy driving those better, right? So I mean, there's just so many values, and we probably can't get them on the roads fast enough, and but ultimately, I thought it was just really cool because it's experiences like that where you can actually see progress in motion, right? Whereas like 5 years ago, we talked about these, but then now we're seeing them. So similar to that, I'll kind of talk about a really interesting article. I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal article about Metallica and their European tour. If not, really cool. So they basically powered their entire European tour with low emissions vehicles. 7,200-mile journey. They used two different types of trucks and fuels, but it was just really cool. You have to check it out. But really neat way to think about how just, again, times are changing. Going back, we keep connecting the dots back to our e-commerce retail days, but like there's a lot of innovation happening in the just sustainability space, relative. We talked about Tesla, but it's just even the abundance of like lower emission fuels and supply of that increasing, and there's just a lot. So again, that's the encouraging part of it, where I think you can actually see the progress happen. And we'll get to the hopefully tipping point soon where it just becomes really easy for companies to go execute strategies. So.
Yeah. I'm not super optimistic that it's going to get easy, but I do think we're accelerating on the approach to
easier. Yeah.
And also understanding that it's a non-elective part of doing business. I think to your point, it is easier at least to acknowledge every day how much is happening to make it more viable in every sense. I hadn't heard that about Metallica, but I actually think those kinds of examples are really important. One of our past guests, a company called My Emissions, provided, meal footprint labeling at the, Champions League final, football or soccer, as we call it here. I think the Olympics also had some labeling. A lot of the big stadiums are doing more with reusable or returnable packaging. Yep. None of it is without setbacks, issues, challenges, controversy. But as with any quote unquote overnight success, it usually takes a decade or so of trial and error, cumulative learning. Yeah. And so I think what you and I both saw happen with e-commerce and online grocery was there was a point when it was an inevitability, and you had a smaller cohort of people that were on that tip of the spear, learning by doing, and then eventually it got to be such a big part of how the industry was evolving. It became part of everybody's work. And I think what you all are doing at ZeroMe is in that same vein. You're helping make it a part of everybody's life and work, not 100% of a small population's life and work.
Yep, I think you kind of nailed it there. I mean, it's just, how do we get everyone to think about it? And a bunch of small impacts that people make go a very long way versus us having to conquer the biggest challenge in front of us. So it's kind of we think it's the way we think about it. So I think it's a great way to kind of conclude our value proposition and what we're trying to do.
Ankit, it's awesome to catch up. If people want to learn more about ZeroMe or get in touch with you, where would you send them?
Yeah. So our LinkedIn page, I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free to look me up, and I'm sure you can always connect us. We also have a website, so just go check out our website. So from there, happy to just catch up and schedule calls with people if they want to learn more about the platform. So we have a cool team that's out there working. We'll be at a couple of the sustainability conferences. So Sustainable Brands is in San Diego, and then we'll also be at Green Biz. So we'll be out and about and trying to just share our story and what we're doing.
Well, good luck, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem, Keith. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. I'm Keith Anderson, the executive producer and host of Decarbonizing Commerce. Sonic Futures handles audio, music, and video production. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you took a moment to subscribe and leave a review or share it with a colleague. For the full episode and more member-exclusive insight and analysis, join the Decarbonizing Commerce community at decarbonize.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Decarbonizing Commerce.